an Arab's wonderful record of 30 years of travel. It was in actuality this great East, noisy with nations and kings, and Ibn Battuta, a learned and intrepid Arab, spent 30 years between 1304 and 1378 in travel over a route which included Mecca, Persia, Mesopotamia, Arabia, Africa, Asia Minor, Bukhara, India, China, and Sumatra. That was a wonderful record for days when half the ships at sea were pirates and many of the men on the roads were brigands. The first condition made honest seagoing a peril. The second made overland trade increasingly hazardous and unprofitable. Goods from the east had to be carried by land to the Levant or up the Red Sea to Egypt. In either case, all had to go to Marco Polo's home, Venice, for distribution to the rest of Europe. Oh, for a seaway to the east, was the cry. The discovery of Madeira in 1420 by João Gonçalves Zarco in Tristão Vaz, 535 miles from Lisbon, took Portuguese ships southwest, but it was a step towards more distant goals, for it encouraged Bartholomew Dias, another Portuguese, to test the possibilities of the African coast. Let us remember that the ships of the period were only little half-decked boats, carrying at most 36 men, with bad and insufficient food, and let us not forget that mariners' terrors of aerial fire, the breath of death in the vicinity of the equator, were real and tragic. A perilous voyage to penetrate the gateway to the east. Dias overcame them. Setting sail in 1486, he took two little vessels down the west coast of Africa, sailed through the latitudes said to be fatal to life, reached the Cape of Good Hope, and at its foot he reached Algoa Bay, without quite knowing how great was his feat. Before he could realize that the gateway to the east had been penetrated, his crew mutinied and forced him to return home. Fate was hard to poor Dias. When the next Portuguese expedition set out, he was placed under Vasco da Gama, and the prize of the Golden East fell to his leader. Dias was turned back by da Gama from that memorable voyage and died in 1500 in a ship which became a wreck. Between the feats of Dias and da Gama came Columbus's immortal first 3 voyages across the Atlantic and Cabot's discovery of the North American mainland. The Spanish success in the west caused Portugal to redouble her efforts towards the east, and it was in 1497 that da Gama was sent forth with 3 little ships to double the Cape of Good Hope and strike out for India. Vasco da Gama finds the way to India by sea. His men were just as frightened as those of Dias and Columbus had been, but he kept on, and at last reached the Cape of Good Hope, and found that he could get round to the other side of Africa. Terrible storms seemed likely to swallow up his ships. His crew begged him to go back. "I will never go back until I have set foot in India," he said. Some of the men made up their minds to kill him, but he put these men in irons and himself took command of the steering of the ship. They reached the Indian Ocean and sailed along the east coast of Africa, found great cities. At one of these they were able to get a pilot who knew his way across the waters. They reached Calcutta in India at last, and tried to make friends with the king of Calcutta. He was a bad man, and after taking their presents, tried to kill them. They managed to return to Portugal, having found out one of the most important things in the world, the way to India by sea. Triumphs of discovery that led to the expansion of trade. So in 5 years there came 2 of the most memorable of triumphs. The attempt to find India in the west produced America. The attempt to find India by sea in the east succeeded. In less than a quarter of a century later, Cortés had entered Mexico, Pizarro was engaged in the conquest of Peru, and trade was streaming east and west. We read elsewhere the great deeds of Columbus. Here we must note a consequence. There was a scrambler for territory between Spain and Portugal. The Pope decided that all of the newly found lands in the east and west should be divided between the 2 countries, and a dispute arose as to whom the Moluccas belonged. Portugal claimed these islands, but Ferdinand Magellan, who had quitted his native land for Spain, declared that they belonged to that country and was equipped by Charles V to sail around the world and take the Moluccas and anything else he might succeed in discovering. The ships went out from Seville to the west on September 20th, 1519, and returned from the east on September the 8th, 1522. 3 years, all but 12 days, but when they got back, instead of the 5 ships and 270 men with which they had started, they had only 1 ship and 18 men. Sebastian del Cano was in command. The brave Magellan was dead. Let us see what had happened to him. He struck out boldly for what we now know as South America. Nobody had ever been able to get to the end of it. Nobody could tell whether it was possible to get around it or through it. Some of his men rose in mutiny, and 1 ship left him because the crew were too frightened to go farther. Del Cano, to his eternal shame, was among the mutineers. He, like the rest, was mastered and forgiven.